are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and we are joined by Dr. Gerald Horne, a regular on Diasporic Music. And Dr. Horne's recent book is African Americans, A New History of the U.S., and that was put together by Dr. Horne and Tiana Paris, a young sister, a great scholar out of, I believe she's out of the UK. And we wanted to, we had quite a few things to talk about. And before we really get started, Dr. Horne, I have a question to ask you. How do you feel about, like moving to Canada, and a lot of other people, in one in particular, you're kind of following in the tradition of Martin R. Delaney, the brother that many feel is one of the founders of Pan-Africanism. How do you feel about that?
About Delaney or moving to Canada?
Moving to both.
Well, Delaney, his record speaks for itself. I mean, it's little that I could say to embellish it further. With regard to moving to Canada, obviously, this has been a sanctuary for Africans in the United States of America for decades. It contributed directly to the War of 1812. As a matter of fact, I was watching CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, the other day, the rally in Toronto, the Elbows Up movement, which is designed to confront Mr. Trump and his desire to annex Canada. And one of the handmade signs read, "Wasn't the pasting we gave you folks in the War of 1812 sufficient? Do you want another pasting?" So interestingly enough, of course, as you may know, and I'll repeat it, I hope this is not redundant, part of my research here involves the movement en masse of Black people from San Francisco in the 1850s, fleeing racist terror in the city by the bay, to come to Victoria, British Columbia, where I'm now sitting, where the governor, Sir James Douglas, was of African ancestry. It's quite a tale, I must say, because this was during a time of sharp contestation with the United States, which could have erupted in war, but for the U.S. getting enmeshed in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And in fact, there were those in Washington who wanted a war with Canada to unite the country so as to avoid civil war. And also, it was a time of contestation with the Russians and neighboring Alaska. The Russians, of course, sold their claims to Alaska to the United States shortly after the conclusion of the U.S. Civil War. But sadly and tragically, and this is what I'll deal with quite a bit in this book, it was a time of sharp contestation with the indigenous population as well, where Sir James Douglas played a pivotal role. And part of the takeaway, even though I'm in the foothills of this research, is that it's difficult to put a smiley face or a pretty face on settler colonialism, even if it involves Black people fleeing terror in San Francisco and landing in British Columbia, where, by the way, many of their descendants continue to reside.
You're listening to Diasporic Music, and Melinda, you can kick it off.
Yeah, why don't we go to, this has been on the deck for a bit, but Afrikaners in the U.S.
Well, I take it you're referring to the fact of the deteriorating relationship on all fronts between the United States and South Africa. The United States is upset because South Africa is part of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. South Africa dragged U.S. ally Israel into the International Court of Justice, making out a plausible case for genocide of Israel perpetrating against the Palestinian population in light of the events beginning October 2023, if not before, and going to this very day. And so what's happened is that with the advent of the Trump regime, there is a developing Cold War between South Africa and the United States, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, was supposed to visit South Africa for a meeting of foreign ministers of the Group of 20, which includes South Africa, which is this club of leading nations worldwide that meets annually, supplanting, if you like, the Group of 7 led by the United States, the Western Europeans, and Japan. As noted, Mr. Rubio boycotted that meeting. The Secretary of the Treasury boycotted another meeting that was to take place in South Africa. And then that gets to the nub of your question, which is that Mr. Trump has charged that the Afrikaners, as they call themselves, the descendants of predominantly Dutch settlers who landed on the southern tip of Africa in 1652, then supplemented by French Protestants fleeing to that part of the world a few years later. And of course, they were the spearhead of the implementation of the hated apartheid system, 1948, not to mention decades, if not centuries, of white supremacy before that. And it took a massive struggle, as this audience well knows, to bring the overthrow, at least politically, of the apartheid regime. Although their toxic legacy continues to percolate, you can't understand the allegations of corruption directed at the African National Congress ruling party without understanding the fact that there is probably the most skewed racist maldistribution of wealth on planet Earth in South Africa than anywhere else. And so oftentimes when folks get the reins of power in their hands, they feel compelled to try to dip into the public coffers to compensate for these centuries of oppression and, of course, to help their families along. In any case, Mr. Trump has made out a case that if we are not careful in the United States, we, referring to him and his cronies, that the alleged allegations of terror against so-called white controllers of property and privilege, that kind of process can be visited upon the United States of America, which helps underscore his attempt to overthrow diversity, equity, and inclusion to the point where any Black person in any prominent position is assumed to be a so-called DEI hire, which means their presence is illegitimate and therefore they should be dislodged. In terms of the mass firings and layoffs by the so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency, led by Elon Musk of South African heritage, it has disproportionately impacted the city of Washington, not coincidentally, which has a substantial Black population, which is something I discuss, as you know, in my book, Revolting Capital. So this crisis in relations between South Africa and the United States is not going away anytime soon. I hope that it causes some of our friends on the left to place these recent moves of aggression by Mr. Trump, place that in the wider context of their critiques of what they consider to be the laggard attempt at South Africa to redistribute the wealth, because you see what happens when there are attempts to redistribute the wealth, because what triggered Mr. Trump was the passing of a law that would allow, after elaborate judicial process, for land to be redistributed. This was seen as a kind of casus belli, a kind of cause for war. And that is certainly what's unfolding as we speak, at least a Cold War with regard to Pretoria and Washington.
You're listening to Diasporic music. Don't you find it strange that, you know, that whole Afrikaner situation, they use they spell Africa, you know, with a K. And I remember in the 70s, there would be almost fist fights would break out among those. Some people insist that we as Africans in the West use K as opposed to a C in Africa. Do you remember those days?
I do. And I must say that in the wider scheme of things, I understand the concern. But in any case, that concern seems not as important and profound as these real life battles that are unfolding as we speak.
Could we talk about, Elon Musk and the whole question of the attack on his automobile, the Tesla?
Well, as you probably know, the attack had been ferocious in Canada in particular, which is ironic since he is also a partial Canadian heritage, as we all know. And there have been attacks on dealerships of Tesla. There are attacks on the cars themselves. Drivers feel embarrassed. This is happening to feel embarrassed to drive these automobiles. As one put it, it feels like you're driving a big red MAGA cap, Make America Great Again cap, the emblem of the Trump machine. This is happening on both sides of the border. It has something to do with the stock plummeting of Tesla and of Mr. Musk's various enterprises. There was a striking article in the Financial Times of London some days ago that suggested that in going from federal bureaucracy to federal bureaucracy, Mr. Musk is helping himself to intelligence that will help to solidify his tyrannical corporate empire. And that is to say, for example, he can go into a government office and figure out what patents for new inventions are about to be validated by the government agency, and then take that intelligence and perhaps use it for his own narrow means. He can get intelligence on his competitors, for example, who are seeking to develop these so-called driverless cars. That includes Google, that includes Uber, and it has included Uber until recently, and that will allow him to steal a march. And so it's a typical story of piracy and brigandage. And I have to underscore this because it's conspicuously missing from too many discourses in the United States of America. That is to say that at the end of the day, we all need to ask the question of how did 77 million plus people vote for Mr. Trump when they had an idea from what transpired between 2017 and 2021 that this kind of outrage would proliferate. And once again, I must say, I don't think you can understand that phenomenon without understanding settler colonialism and the class collaboration between and amongst European settlers that undergirded this system of iniquity that led to genocide against the Native Americans and mass enslavement of the Africans. Until you grapple with class collaboration, you'll be left with these threadbare arguments that the problem is solely that of Mr. Trump. And if you get rid of Mr. Trump, everything will be peachy keen and hunky-dory, which of course is the looniest idea since Looney Tunes. Fortunately, in the midst of the confusion, a number of ideas are erupting. Once again, Canada is in the forefront. I'm speaking of the idea propagated by former Clinton Labor Secretary Robert Reich for there to be a worldwide tourist boycott of the United States. And this might not happen a moment too soon because even tourists of European ancestry from UK and Europe are being hassled and oftentimes detained on spurious grounds when trying to enter the United States of America. We hear stories about the fabled snowbirds of Canada, who oftentimes at this time of year flock to Florida and Arizona, that they are not doing so. We see that conflicts are breaking out in border towns, such as the border between Quebec and Vermont, for example. And I must say that I might be feeling a bit of the backlash personally because I go into the United States on a weekly basis to get my mail. And when I return to Canada, I've noticed that the folks at the border guard, so-called, they're not necessarily welcoming to a person like myself. So stay tuned.
Another question, Melinda?
Yeah, do we want to move to the federal elections in Canada?
Well, as you know more than most, Mark Carney, the former central banker in both Canada and England, is now the Liberal Party designate prime minister. He's called for snap elections that will be taking place in a few weeks. The Liberals were behind as recently as a few months ago and were expected to take a real pasting before incumbent Prime Minister Mr. Trudeau decided to step down. It's still unclear to me, at least, whether or not Mr. Carney and his Liberals will prevail. According to the Toronto Globe and Mail, which is, I guess you could say, the leading English language newspaper in this country of 41 million, the New Democratic Party, which has significant influence out here on the Pacific Coast in British Columbia, are not expected to perform adequately in the federal elections, although we shall see, because I don't expect the Globe and Mail to be unbiased when it comes to analyzing the Social Democratic NDP. I should also mention something that I don't think I had an opportunity to mention previously, which is that I noticed on CBC, which is one of the reasons I've been tuning in regularly, that just a few weeks ago, there was a French nuclear submarine that landed at Halifax. This was right before Mr. Carney left Canada for his first foreign visit, not initially to London, that was his second stop, but to France, interestingly enough, not to London to break bread with the ostensible head of state, speaking of King Charles III. And what we're going to have to watch carefully is whether or not France will seek to lead some sort of anti-Trump global coalition. Now, there are reasons positive and negative for France to do so. Negative in the sense that they're hotly upset with the United States seeking to pull out of Ukraine and would like to have France and Germany and Britain play the role of the United States in Ukraine, which I don't think is either feasible or possible because they don't have the military machinery and material to do so. But positive in the sense that obviously Mr. Trump and his cabal are running roughshod over the US population, threatening to annex Canada, threatening Panama, for example. And so it's interesting that Mr. Trump, who had the audacity to quote the former French leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, to the effect that if you're saving your country, you're not breaking the law, which means that he basically has carte blanche to do whatever he wants and act like a mini dictator. We all know that 200 years ago, it was an international coalition, principally led by London, that helped to bring Napoleon Bonaparte to heel, sending him into temporary exile before he made a comeback and was ultimately defeated. There are those who are suggesting that now the shoe is on the other foot and that Mr. Trump, and speaking of feet, might have put his foot in it in a smoking mess of turd, for example, by invoking the late Napoleon Bonaparte and invoking memories of what happened to that Corsican some centuries ago.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. Can we move to Africa? I think you had you wanted to talk about Congo, Rwanda, the Sudan, and all the issues related to Africa right now.
Well, there's so much with regard to Congo. I'm not sure where to start, but I guess for our audience, we should mention that Mr. Tshisekedi, the leader of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has suggested a minerals for security deal with the United States of America. That is to say, in return for the United States providing perhaps troops, certainly military training, and perhaps even military materiel, so that the Congolese government could battle the so-called M23 rebels, said to be backed by neighboring Rwanda, that the United States would receive in return a motherlode of minerals, or at least have first dibs on a motherlode of minerals. Now, the problem there, of course, is that you have Chinese firms that have signed contracts with regard to these minerals. And in any case, it's not clear if U.S. firms would want to go into a conflict-ridden Eastern Congo, even for a queen's ransom of cobalt and copper and coltan, etc. But in any event, that's the deal that's supposedly on the table. So we should seek to block that deal, because the last thing either country needs is for U.S. boots to be on the ground in Eastern Congo. On a more positive note, the Qataris, the Persian Gulf monarchy that sponsors Al Jazeera, their leader sponsored a mediation session between Paul Kagame of Rwanda and Mr. Tshisekedi of Congo. We haven't received a readout of that session, but let us hope that that's a step forward. On a negative note, the M23 rebels decided to boycott a similar mediation session with the Congolese that was to take place in Angola. Let us hope that they can be coaxed back to the bargaining table. The bottom line, as is apparent, is that the Congolese crisis is still in motion. With regard to the Sudan, the deterioration of the political situation continues apace. That is to say, the so-called RSF, which is a wing of the Sudanese military, is in mortal combat with the overall Sudanese military. Of late, the overall military has inflicted severe blows on the RSF, but the RSF has substantial external support, probably from Kenya, where its leaders have been spotted conspicuously of late, not to mention the United Arab Emirates, who have been playing a rather malignant role in Sudan. And we should also mention the crisis in South Sudan, which is boiling, I'm afraid to say. That is to say, the conflict ostensibly between Salva Kiir, the leader of that country, and Riek Machar, supposedly his number two, that has taken on ethnic overtones, that is destabilizing the country mightily. Of late, neighboring Uganda, under President Museveni, has sent their forces into South Sudan, but it does not appear that they will be a stabilizing force or factor with regard to the crisis in South Sudan.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96, and Melinda, you have some more questions.
Did we get into the alliance with Ghana and the Sahel states?
Well, that's interesting. You know that just some months ago, John Mahama came back to the leadership role in Accra. And since that time, he seemingly has been moving the country to the left. You know that the Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, have entered into a kind of alliance, consolidating the various regimes. This was in partial response to the fact that when you had the change of regime in Niger some months ago, that neighboring Nigeria threatened to intervene militarily, possibly at the instigation of the United States of America. And that soured many of the Sahel states on ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, which is dominated by Nigeria. And so they began to pull back from ECOWAS. Mahama is supposedly with them to a certain degree. And what that suggests is that this part of Africa will be targeted for destabilization. That's what we're going to have to watch out for, because Ironically, we know that with Mr. Trump, at least in a formal sense, saying that he does not want to necessarily get involved in military conflict, although contrast that statement with what we just said about putting boots on the ground in Eastern Congo, contrast that statement with his current bombing of Yemen across the Red Sea from Africa, not to mention the bombing of Somalia. But having said that, to the extent that that preference for non-military means holds in Washington, that'll put a premium on covert action and actions by the U.S. intelligence agencies. The overall director of U.S. intelligence now is former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. And even though her ascension to that post was saluted by some because they thought that during the time of President al-Assad of Syria, she was less hawkish than many of her congressional compatriots, it seems that there is little room for optimism with regard to U.S. intelligence under the administration of one Congresswoman Gabbard.
Dr. Horne, am I smoking something, or didn't I see something in a report, or maybe it's fake news, that Kenya is talking about hooking up with the Sahel Alliance? They flip-flop, or was that fake news?
I didn't see that story, but I'm reluctant to say it's fake news because Kenya is going through a lot of problems now. Part of the problem that hasn't been well reported, although I must say Financial Times did a story on it, is that with Mr. Trump seeking to scuttle and gut the United States Agency for International Development, which, in addition to being involved in a lot of hanky-panky, is also involved in a number of aid projects, particularly delivering food to those who might be on the verge of famine. And in that regard, Nairobi has been a hub because it is within shouting distance of South Sudan, Somalia, and of course, the Tigray region of Ethiopia when that was a hotspot. And so with the cutback in USAID, Nairobi has been hit because a number of the hotels and the watering spots and the whole infrastructure was based upon these USAID workers, once again, using Nairobi as a hub. And so in light of that blow to the Kenyan economy, it helps, I guess, to shed light on why the president was so keen to send his police forces to Haiti. But it also may lead to other situations. For example, an alliance with the Sahel, which admittedly I have not heard about or read about.
Oh, I believe I heard it on the World PRI. I believe I heard it there, but I will. I'm going to check it, and as soon as I find it, as soon as the show is over, I will definitely send it what I saw.
Great.
And Melinda, you have some more.
I don't know. We still have a few things on the list. Where do we want to start? Do we want to go to Israel-Gaza-Yemen?
Well, sure. I've already mentioned that the U.S. administration is bombing Yemen cruelly and mercilessly, quite in a bloodthirsty manner to shock the conscience. This is in response to Yemen imposing what can only be called sanctions against Israel because of its genocide in Gaza. Yemen is operating in the context of the United Nations designated principle responsibility to protect, which argues that if a regime is massacring those within its jurisdiction, then member states of the United Nations have the responsibility to intervene. And that's what the Yemenis have been doing by shooting missiles into Israel. But Mr. Trump has responded by, of course, bombing Yemen This comes in the context of the Israeli authorities consulting the White House before they decide to break out of the White House negotiated truce brokered by Trump advisor Steve Witkoff some weeks ago, a truce between Hamas and Israel. And so we see that even though the United States got credit for negotiating the truce, they were consulted with regard to breaking the truce, and of course have been culpable insofar as they've been bombing the daylights out of Yemen. I should also mention that there's been a lot of loose talk in Israel about deporting the Palestinians en masse to Africa, to Somalia, for example, which has been trying to cultivate positive relations with the United States of America, and as we've said more than once, is a kind of neo-colony of Turkey, insofar as the Turks are involved in everything from picking up the garbage to airport security to now establishing a kind of spaceport in Somalia for its ambitions into extraterrestrial regions. And so this part of East Africa, south of Israel, Palestine, across the Red Sea from Yemen, is becoming a hotspot that we must pay careful and close attention to.
We only have 2 minutes left, so I think, is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, only that I'll be looking forward, like many of us, to what happens with regard to these Canadian elections, whether or not the anti-Trump, anti-US imperialist sentiment will be manifested at the ballot box, and also with regard to this elbows up movement, which is spreading like wildfire from the maritime provinces.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.